Cavanaugh Road, written by best-selling author Michelle E. Gwynn, narrated by Michelle E. Gwynn, copyright 2017, all rights reserved. Part 1, Before the Storm. Arkansas, 1951. I must have traveled Cavanaugh Road a million times. Today was no different, except that it was. The road led from the house I'd lived in outside of Fort Smith, Arkansas since the day I was born, all the way into town. Town consisted of 2 square miles in any direction. There was a post office, the city hall, a grocery store, and a Woolworth's. We even had a moving picture theater, a diner, a drive-in that served hamburgers and shakes, and of course the police and fire departments, which shared one large building older than dirt. Folks either worked their family farms or they worked in one of the businesses in town. There wasn't much else besides a large schoolhouse in between town and home. That's just how it was in 1951. If anyone needed anything else and couldn't find it in town, they ordered it from the Sears Roebuck catalog. It was the summer of my 15th year. It was hotter than a volcano and humid as a sweaty armpit. It was so thick it coated my skin, but still not a drop of rain had fallen. My older cousins worked the farm with my dad and uncle, but he wouldn't let me, his only daughter, do any of the heavy chores involved in raising cows and growing cotton. So I had a lot of time on my hands. I decided maybe I could get a job. Maybe I could help serve lunch at the Woolworth's lunch counter or sell tickets for the Saturday matinee at the movie theater. That was my thought. That and the fact that I could earn money, save it, and be able to move into the big city far from this tiny town once I graduated. If I could manage it, I might find a decent job as a secretary and maybe, just maybe, take a few college courses. I could be a modern woman, have my own room someplace. I did have a strong independent streak in me. Daddy said I got it from him, but Mama whispered it was really the women in our family that inherited this kind of gumption. I knew if I just worked hard, I could make something fine of myself, but I needed to start now because graduation was only 2 summers away. It seemed like a grand plan, so I found myself walking Cavanaugh Road, all 3 miles of it, into town. I got lost inside my own head along the way. A great deal had happened to me over the past year. I'd grown taller and a little curvier. Mama said I was a late bloomer because she'd developed her womanly beauty by the age of 14. She married Daddy the next year. Daddy said I was just right and not to listen to my cousins who constantly told me I was the ugly duckling of my family, that I had been found on the doorstep one dark night and wasn't really related to them. Boys. My hair had grown down my back uncut since I was a little girl, but Daddy finally relented and let me get a real haircut. It didn't really look all that much different, but it was shorter, and the lady at the beauty salon gave me a more sophisticated style. She said bangs were for toddlers, and young ladies sideswept their hair. It did make me feel a little older and wiser. That feeling translated into a new, confident walk with my shoulders back and my newly sprouted bosom pointing forward, leading the way. I looked almost like one of them starlets from the silver screen. Almost. All of this had a strange effect on the boys in my school. Joshua Williams, who'd pulled my brains painfully in 4th grade, now looked at me with a giant, goofy grin on his silly face all the time. Everywhere I went, he was there, smiling at me. It was plain weird. But then he didn't look much like he used to either. Over last summer, he shot up nearly 2 feet and grew some muscles working on his uncle's ranch. His hair got a little curly on the ends and his face seemed less boyish and a whole lot clearer than the year before. I guess he was kind of cute in a way, but his stare made me uncomfortable, so I tried to avoid him most of the time. It didn't help, though, that when he wasn't around, I found myself looking for him. Being 15 is confusing. My 2 best friends, Lucy and Claire, had grown thick as thieves while I stayed home during the summer because my parents didn't want me hanging around Claire. They said she was too wild. Claire rode on the back of a motorcycle with a young Navy boy who'd come through town during the holidays. Apparently, he was a cousin of one of our local boys. There were hushed comments flying around as to what else Claire had done with the handsome young sailor, but no one would tell her when she angrily confronted them to their faces. That's when the gossips clammed up tight, red-faced. Claire said it was all hogwash anyway, but then she'd smile to herself and say people ought to mind their own P's and Q's. It didn't help Claire at all that she chose to wear her sweaters a little too tight, and she painted her cheeks and lips with rouge. All of these things added up to trouble with a capital T in my town. She wasn't even the least bit repentant, which I thought was awfully brave of her. I missed my friends. Being separated from them left me bored, and my parents trying to keep me a little girl led me to thinking about a job. So here I was, walking along the side of the road in 95-degree heat and humidity. The clouds gathered, gray and threatening to spill. It looked like it might actually rain for a change, which meant I needed to hurry. I made it into town before the first downpour. At least I had a sidewalk awning to keep the rain from soaking through my blue dress. I made the rounds to the theater, the diner, and then over to Woolworth's, collecting applications along the way. I sat at Pete's 5 and dime counter, sipping a large cherry soda from their fountain, and filled out each form. It kept me busy while the summer storm raged, drenching the streets and sending folks scrambling inside or to their cars. Some were laughing, downright pleased to finally see the rain fall. I watched a patrol officer run across the road and duck into the police department, but not before he got good and soaked. A strong feeling of déjà vu washed over me at the sight. I sat hoping the rain would end soon so I could drop off my applications and get home safely before nightfall. As summer storms went, it was a short, quick downpour, and after returning one application to the assistant manager at the Woolworth's lunch counter, I quickly retraced my steps to the diner down the street and the theater 2 blocks over. I felt like I'd accomplished quite a bit as I jogged out of town, heading back down Cavanaugh Road for home. The rainstorm left behind a light mist on the air that clung to my hair and skin, making me feel sticky and causing my skirts to cling to my knees. I didn't care. I skipped through the grass and rocks alongside the asphalt and hummed "I Can Dream, Can't I?" by the Andrews Sisters. The scent of damp earth filled my nose, and the mist thickened again halfway home as thunder cracked overhead. Another round of rain was coming. I looked up. The sun briefly cut through the clouds, blinding me. I reached up, trying to touch the rays. They felt warm, and there were shapes in the brightness that filled my eyes. It made me happy. Then it began to pour. I kept to the gravel off the shoulder of the road as sheets of rain came down. The heavy gray clouds wiped out the few rays of sunshine, and the day grew dark. I knew by the time I got home, Mama was going to be furious at me, and Daddy would think he had a drowned rat for a daughter. In the distance, the sound of an engine steadily grew louder than the pounding rain and thunder. A car was coming. Not many folks traveled in this direction, which meant it was probably someone I knew. It was approaching fast, so I walked up onto the shoulder of the road, intent on flagging them down. If I could catch a ride, Mama might not be quite so mad. My foot slipped, and I went down, barely catching myself. If I didn't get up fast, whoever it was would pass right by without even seeing me. I jumped up and ran the few steps to the roadside. A green Chevy truck flew past, hit the brakes, and fishtailed as it skidded to a halt. I could see the bright red of the taillights. I knew that truck. A young man with curly hair and broad shoulders stepped out of the driver's side, leaving the door open. He stood there staring at me with his mouth hanging wide. I knew I looked a fright, but this was just insulting. "Joshua Williams, stop standing there catching flies and give me a ride home." I laughed at his astonishment. Truthfully, he looked a little nauseous, which only increased my own deep embarrassment for looking such a fright. Another boy leaned out of the passenger side staring at me. It was Timothy Jones, Joshua's best friend. I never liked him much. I was sure by the way he always teased me that the feeling was mutual. He too looked like he'd never seen a wet girl before. I knew then that I looked horrible, probably full of mud and grass from my fall, as well as soaked to the skin. A wet cat for sure, because they always look so sweet and fluffy when dry, but like shaved rats when wet. "Come on, Josh, we have to get out of here. Get in, let's go." "Are you seriously going to just drive off and leave me here?" I asked. I couldn't believe it. I knew I'd ignored him a lot lately, but that was no reason to abandon me to the roadside in the middle of a storm. Joshua Williams, you come back here!" I called out to his back as he turned and ran back to his truck. The taillights grew distant as I shouted at him and cursed both of them for being so ungentlemanly. I didn't care if he'd just gotten his driver's permit. By the time I finished telling my daddy what happened and Daddy told Mr. Williams, Joshua wouldn't be driving again for a very long time. I was madder than a wet cat. I stood there, suddenly cold in the summer heat. The hour was growing late, and the storm raged on as I began, once again, walking Cavanaugh Road. Mama was going to be so angry with me. Part 2. Good Deeds. Fort Smith, summer, 1971. Jake left the windows down in his car. It was the first official day of summer, and the heat was pressing. Still, he wore a smile that twinkled in his blue eyes. He'd just turned 18, had a job waiting the counter at Pete's Diner for the second summer in a row, and had just purchased his first vehicle, a 1968 Javelin, a choice his dad was none too happy about. He couldn't be prouder of himself. Now, if he could find a girlfriend to fill the passenger seat beside him in his new used American muscle car, his life would be complete, and he could die a happy man. Well, almost a man. He still hadn't ventured into that territory fully yet, which seemed a shame since he had to register for the draft and all. His best friend Joe had already been carted off to Vietnam straight out of high school. The only reason a gun hadn't been shoved into his hands before being booted out of an airplane was because his 18th birthday came a month after graduation. His brother Bobby had been drafted the year before. They'd only heard from him through sporadic letters and lived on the edge of fear because the Army wouldn't allow their soldiers to disclose their whereabouts. Jake was fully aware his life could be turned upside down at a moment's notice, so he was enjoying what little bit he could. He gunned the engine and stuck his face out the window, feeling like his dog, Bingo, when his dad would take them both along into town on weekends. Bingo never failed to shove his hairy face out the window, letting the wind whip through his fur, causing his cheeks to flap wildly. In those moments, he looked like a goofy cartoon character instead of the black Labrador retriever that he was. Jake figured he understood the old dog better now and applauded him for always appreciating this simple pleasure in life. The Javelin picked up speed, engine roaring like a lion as he flew down Cavanaugh Road. There was nothing but small farms along the way on this stretch, just a country road on the outskirts of Fort Smith. He passed Baker Farm on the right. The old gray house with a wraparound porch had seen better days. It had fallen into disrepair over the years, and the land it sat on now was farmed by co-op tenants. There was a large oak tree off to the side, about 60 feet high. It was probably about 100 years old at Jake's reckoning, but it was the small, fenced-in family cemetery that sat beneath its branches that gave him the willies. He never understood why old people put graveyards on their property. His dad once explained that it was just the way of things back in the day. Farms were too far from town to transport a body then, and most farmers couldn't afford fancy funerals, so they held their burials on their own land, inviting family and friends while the local reverend came to say a few words and offer a prayer. This old plot was surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The metal was rusted, and part of the fence looked about to fall over with the next blast of wind. It wouldn't be long before it hit the ground, and then the dead inside would be able to get out. Jake shuddered. When he was 5, his older brother Bobby told him fences were put around cemeteries because the dead were just dying to get out. That scared the bejesus out of Jake, and he cried, prompting their dad to reach out and smack Bobby on the back of his head. It wasn't until he was much older that he got the joke, but by then the seed had been firmly planted, and every time they passed Baker Farm, Jake would peek over the door out the window, afraid the ghost of the dead would see him and hop the fence to come after him. Once he passed the old place, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. As Jake drew closer to town, he slowed down. He didn't want to get a ticket from Sheriff Jackson, and he didn't want to arrive too early for work either. He still had another 30 minutes to go before clocking in. That worked out fine, as it took nearly 20 minutes to find a parking spot downtown. Pete's Diner sat on Main Street. There were only a handful of spots out front, and several of them were metered until after 5. Jake found a non-metered space around the backside in the alleyway where he usually parked. He sat in his car, listening to the radio. Creedence Clearwater Revival came on, singing Sweet Hitchhiker. He sang along, using his fingers to drum out the beat on the steering wheel. In that moment, life was perfect. The moment passed too soon, and after the lyrics were sung, Jake turned off the engine, rolled up his windows, and locked up his Javelin before making his way around the corner. The dinner shift felt like a madhouse that night. Of course, it was the same every Saturday night. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow. He'd served up plate after plate at the counter while Flora, their waitress, handled the booths. At 32, and the mother of 2 young boys of her own, Flora could really hustle. Jake didn't know how she managed to work as hard as she did and still have energy left over to raise her kids. Somewhere in between it all, she even managed to give him advice about this and that, and fuss over him, making sure he had his break. The woman even had Herb, their weekend cook, whip up a burger for him that she plated and served up in the back corner away from the patrons. While he ate, Flora made sure the customers at the counter had refills on coffee and sodas. She was phenomenal. It hadn't escaped Jake's attention that Flora was also a beautiful woman. She had a habit of fluffing his brown hair with her fingernails in passing, while telling everyone within earshot, "Isn't he handsome? If only I were 10 years younger, or you were 10 years older, mijo." He blushed every time, both embarrassed and also flattered that such a gorgeous woman thought he basically, still a kid, was handsome. Jake sat in the back corner, taking big bites out of his cheeseburger as he watched Flora fly from one customer to the next. Her long black hair was tied up in a ponytail that never stayed still. She never stayed still. Her large brown eyes twinkled and reflected the smile she had for everyone. He hoped to one day find someone as amazing as Flora. As he tracked her movement from the booths to the counter, something caught his eye in the large front-facing window. Jake glanced out and saw a young girl standing on the sidewalk, staring in. She was pretty. She had blonde hair that flowed over her shoulders. The ends curled just a bit, but it was the expression in her eyes that held him. She seemed sad. He couldn't tell the color of her eyes from the distance, but they watched the people sitting inside and, like himself, followed Flora as she made her rounds. Finally, the girl's eyes locked with his, and Jake felt his heart stop. It felt like he was free-falling through the clouds. He was breathless and couldn't seem to get enough air, and a familiar heat crept up his cheeks. The moment stretched out for an eternity, and then she turned, walking away and out of sight. Jake jumped up and ran to the front door. He stopped to let a couple inside, then pushed his way onto the sidewalk, looking in the direction she'd gone. He scanned down and then across Main Street. She wasn't anywhere to be found. "What are you doing, Jakey?" Flora poked her head outside. Jake started to speak. There was a girl. His voice faded. Flora laughed. "Oh, I see. Well, if she's a smart girl, she'll be back. Come inside, your break is over and I need your help." She walked back in, leaving Jake standing there. Finally, he turned, but for the rest of the night, all he could think about was the pretty blonde girl. He wondered who she was, and if he'd see her again. Monday arrived, a harbinger of bad news. Jake was out back washing his car when a dark sedan pulled up in the front yard. His mother, Laura, screamed. Jake ran to the front porch and found his mom on her knees, bent over, sucking in gobs of air in between high-pitched wails of grief. 2 men in uniform stood before her, with a sealed letter in hand, offering their condolences. The taller of the two, a man with somber brown eyes, spoke. "The Secretary of the Army has asked me to express his deep regrets that your son, Private First Class Robert Alexander Williams, was killed in action in Vietnam on June 29th. Private Williams' battalion came under heavy fire while on a mission. He died fighting for his country and saved 2 fellow soldiers before falling. His commander is recommending commendation post-mortem. The Secretary extends his deepest sympathy to you and your family in your tragic loss." The second man, who had reddish hair and a rather large nose, extended his hand. Jake reached out automatically, taking the gold-sealed envelope. He addressed Jake. "And you are?" Jake opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, "Jake Williams, Bobby's brother." The man shook his hand. "My condolences, sir. We want you to know that the Army has various disposition options, benefits, and allowances available. Your family should delay making any decisions on care and preparation of the remains until they've been fully briefed by the mortuary office or the casualty assistance officer. The CAO will be contacting you as soon as Private Williams' remains arrive back stateside. If you have any questions between now and then, you can contact this number." He handed Jake a card. "And someone will assist you." The soldier looked back down at Jake's mother. "Will you be all right? Is there someone we can call for you?" Jake shook his head. "My dad. But I can call him. It's okay." Pain clenched Jake's gut, forming a tight knot. "All right, son. Again, we're deeply sorry for your loss," the red-haired officer stated. The two men stepped back and in unison offered a respectful salute before turning to leave. Jake felt frozen in place. His mother's cries finally broke through her own paralysis, and he dropped down beside her, holding her tight. "Your father," his mother moaned. "We have to tell him. Tell him, Bobby." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jake rocked them back and forth as tears blurred his own vision. It was another half hour before he was able to get his mother up off the porch and inside, where he helped her lie down on the couch. He walked into the kitchen and stared at the bright yellow phone on the wall. As if in a dream, he picked it up and dialed. On the other end, his father's silence was followed by the click of the line going dead. In less than an hour, he was home, grieving alongside his wife. Outside, the mailman pulled up to their box. Jake watched as he shoved several letters inside before driving off down the road to the next home. On automatic pilot, he walked outside to the mailbox. It was there the rest of his world fell apart. As he stood in shock, staring down at the draft notice, clouds rolled in, raising the summer heat to suffocating levels. He couldn't take any more. Jake ran to the back of the house, jumped in the Javelin, and took off at breakneck speed down Cavanaugh Road. Part 3. An Unexpected Savior. The heavens unleashed a torrent of rain, and Jake still pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The thicket of black clouds overhead blocked out the sun, turning day to dusk. Lightning lit up the sky, cracking like a whip and shaking the earth with an angry rumble. For the first time ever, he didn't even notice the large oak tree standing vigil over the fenced family cemetery at Baker Farm. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, even though Jake himself had retreated deep inside his own head. His windshield wipers couldn't move fast enough to clear the water from his view. In one terrifying moment, his tires hit more than an inch of water on the asphalt, and the Javelin hydroplaned out of control. Jake gripped the steering wheel, pulling hard in the opposite direction of the skid as he'd been taught. Panic squeezed his heart as a lump rose up in his throat. He'd already let off the gas pedal as instinct shouted at him to hit the brake, but he knew better. Hitting the brake would flip the car, so he hung on for dear life as he spun around, the force yanking the wheel in his white-knuckled grip. He heard a loud thud as the car whipped to a stop off the side of the road, landing in the ditch. In those few terrifying seconds, he saw someone standing out in the rainstorm, right before the impact. Silence filled the car, except for the ringing in Jake's ears. Time moved in slow motion as he lay across the seat, confused and dazed. The rain pelted the metal of the car roof hard, a steady tapping. His vision dimmed in and out, the serenity of unconsciousness beckoning. A loud creaking sound, metal grinding on metal, reached his ears. Fresh air gusted inside, and a cool hand touched his cheek. In the few seconds before he passed out, Jake saw her sweet face, and he smiled. He wasn't alone. The angel from the diner window was here to save him. Jake came to with an awful headache. He reached up and felt his face. His fingers encountered a sticky substance above his right eye, and he winced. He held his hand out and focused on his fingers, noticing the blood. His face was cut. Carefully, he examined himself, moving his head left, then right, working his hands down his body, checking for any other injuries. When he found none, he tried to sit up. A wave of nausea hit, and he relaxed, laying back down. It subsided after a few shallow breaths, and he made a second attempt, slower this time. Finally, he was upright in his seat. Memory came flooding back. His brother's death, the draft notice, driving like a lunatic, and the wreck. There was something else, another detail nagging at him. He concentrated hard, causing his head to pound, but then he remembered. There was a girl. She found him after the crash. She'd touched his face and whispered something soothing. He looked around. Where was she? There was no one in sight, only a steady rain falling, splashing his left side. That was when he became aware the driver's side door was open. Jake leaned out to pull it closed, but caught sight of something out of the ordinary in the muddy ground beside the Javelin. Footprints. Small, feminine, shoe-shaped footprints. She'd definitely been here, he thought. Maybe she'd gone for help? He looked around again, but no cars passed by and no one showed up. He had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. It may have been minutes or hours. He didn't have his watch with him. It was still sitting on the workbench at the house. That's where his dad stored the tools and the bucket and chamois they used to wash the family car, his new Javelin, and Dad's old green truck. The Chevy was more than 20 years old, and his dad wouldn't let anyone else drive it. Not that anyone could. It didn't run anymore. But his father said he couldn't part with it. Jake had often witnessed his dad from the kitchen window, sitting behind the wheel, tossing back a few beers, alone. A few times, he thought he saw him crying, but his dad never cried. It might have been a trick of the light or too many cans of Coors. He didn't know, and never bothered to ask. His dad wasn't the most open man. He was usually quiet and kept to himself. Knowing this, Jake had still taken off like a bat out of hell, leaving his mother with an emotionally stymied man who couldn't begin to know how to help her. He hadn't thought, only reacted to the moment. He'd been overwhelmed, needing to blow off steam, and his recklessness had nearly cost him his life. He felt tired, unable to cope. He needed to go back, face things like an adult, because he was now an 18-year-old man, and his mother needed him. He just didn't know how he was going to tell her about the draft notice. It was too much for him. It would be too much for her. He'd wait a few days, let things settle, and then deal with it. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. He gave the ignition a try. It sputtered. He pumped the gas and cranked it again. This time, the engine actually turned over. He was surprised. All he wanted was to make it home. If the damn car died in the driveway, it wouldn't matter. He'd be leaving soon anyhow. Depressed, beaten, and bruised, he put the Javelin in gear and steered out of the grassy ditch up onto Cavanaugh Road, leaving behind a set of tire tracks next to one pair of footprints. He drove slowly this time, squinting through the blurry windshield. The passenger side windshield wiper wasn't working. In fact, it was bent back and poking out like a broken bone. Great. As he passed Baker Farm, the familiar feeling of apprehension seized him, this time stronger than usual. He fought the urge to glance at the oak tree and the family plot beneath. The urge won, and when his sore neck turned left, his eyes caught sight of her. The girl. She was there, standing just outside of the leaning wrought iron fence. Beneath the thick boughs, she stared at the headstones. The picture she made was one of loneliness and grief. Jake had never seen anyone in all the years he'd traveled Cavanaugh Road go anywhere near the little cemetery. He couldn't even imagine anyone wanting to, let alone this girl. And she was very pretty. He strained to catch one last look at her before losing sight of her completely. She turned and stared straight at him. Jake felt the air leave his lungs. A car horn blared, sending his stomach to his feet as he whipped around in time to jerk the wheel and get the car back onto his side of the road. The fast action sent pain shooting up into his skull and down his back. "Damn it, Jake! Pay attention! You already almost died once today," he scolded himself. On the way home, he wondered just who this girl was and why he hadn't met her before. She had to be a relative of the Bakers, a granddaughter maybe. She was either visiting for the summer or perhaps staying with them now. He didn't know, but he sure wanted to. He'd ask his dad. He knew the Bakers. They'd been around since way back when his father was still in grade school. He arrived home and parked out back. His dad poked his head outside and eyed the bent windshield wiper. Jake knew there would be questions. With all that had happened that day, he decided to be frugal with his answers. He didn't want to add to their misery. Part 4. Secrets Untold. 2 days passed. Jake found himself playing nursemaid to his mother, administering the sleeping pills prescribed by her physician. Dr. Turner was a friend of the family and had paid a personal house call to check on them. His mom, Laura, hadn't been able to sleep, so Turner wrote out a script, which Jake ran into town to fill at the pharmacy. "Now, Jake," Doc Turner began, "these are just to help your mom get some rest. I don't want her taking more than 2 a night." He placed the paper script in Jake's hand. "You make sure that's all she gets, and no alcohol with these pills. That would be dangerous. Got it?" Jake nodded. "Good. And how are you? Your dad says you had a little accident in your new car. Any pain or problems?" He gripped Jake's chin and held up one finger. "Follow my hand with your eyes, but don't move your neck." Jake did as bid. "I'm okay, Doc. Just a little sore still in my neck." "Whiplash, most likely." He released Jake's chin, satisfied. "Put some hot compresses on your neck and shoulders every day for the next 10. No heavy lifting or activities. Just take it easy. I can write you a note for work. I don't want you overdoing anything right now. Between the stress, the grief, and your accident, a lot could go wrong." Dr. Turner wrote out a work excuse on his script pad and pulled it off, handing it over. "Give that to Pete. He and Flora can handle things for a few days." He patted Jake on the shoulder. "Thanks, Doc." After a few minutes talking with Mr. Williams, the doctor left. Jake picked up his keys and headed out. He planned to hit the pharmacy first and then stop by the diner. His dad stopped him at the door. "There's no way you're driving anywhere on your own right now, son. Not after what Doc just said." "But, Dad, I have to get Mom's prescription." "I know. I'll drive." His dad said it in a no-nonsense way and walked out ahead of Jake, leaving him with no room to protest. Sighing, he followed and climbed into the passenger side of his dad's Scamp. The old brown car chugged up the gravel driveway, and they turned right onto Cavanaugh Road. The rain had lingered, with the weatherman saying a tropical disturbance in the Gulf was the culprit. Everyone waited to see if it would turn into a hurricane. In the meantime, the Gulf states saw widespread flooding. Puddles filled in the potholes, and Jake felt every single one that the Scamp hit. The pain spiked through his back and neck, but he toughed it out. As soon as he got home, he would plug in the heating pad and lay on it. They approached the bend in the road near Baker Farm. Remembering the girl, he turned, looking out. "Dad, you know the Bakers," he stated. His dad didn't answer right away. Finally, "Yes, why?" "I saw a girl the other day. Do they have a granddaughter?" Mr. Williams' jaw ticked. "No, not that I'm aware." "They don't have kids? They've been around here forever." "No kids," his dad answered, his face tight. "At least, not anymore." Jake looked at his father. "Not anymore? What do you mean?" His dad looked away, staring off to the left while steering the car forward. "They had one child, a daughter." Jake waited for him to continue. When he didn't, he prompted him. "Had? What happened to her?" His dad turned and looked at him. His eyes seemed pained. "She died." What? When was this? Jake was curious. Mr. Williams returned his attention to the road. Back in high school. What happened to her? Car accident, right here on Cavanaugh, was all he said. Jake sucked in a breath. Now he understood. This had to be why his dad had been so upset after his own wreck the other day, and why he wouldn't let him drive now. It made sense. They already lost Bobby to a war no one wanted to fight, and then he'd gone off like a lunatic and had nearly got himself killed. I'm sorry, Dad. Jake spoke the words softly. They passed the main traffic light in town and cruised down Main Street. Jake thought about coincidences and how things were almost always related. Dad, what was her name? We're here. His dad cut him off as he parked and shut off the engine. The bright red pharmacy sign blinked in the window. Mr. Williams got out and Jake followed. They got in line with the other customers and waited to get Laura Williams' sleeping pills. A half hour passed before they finished that errand. Only one more left. They walked the 2 blocks down to the diner. May as well order some burgers to go. Your mom's in no shape to worry about cooking. His dad approached the counter and smiled when Flora came to take his to-go order. Jake didn't often see his dad smile. It was odd, but nice. He went to the kitchen to give Pete his doctor's note. After giving Jake a hard time about how he was going to run his business short one employee, he laughed and told him not to worry. His job would be waiting when he came back. That's when Jake told Pete the terrible thing he hadn't even told his parents yet. Pete's laughter died on his lips. He grew quiet, concern in his old eyes. Before Jake could react, he pulled the young man in for a tight hug. Your job will be here, kid, no matter what. You just come back, you hear? Jake was surprised by the emotional response from the usually jovial man. I will, Pete. You better. I'm holding you to it. Now get out of here. Go home and take care of your mom while you can. Everyone in town had heard about Bobby Williams by then, so Pete's reaction wasn't out of the norm. Jake left the kitchen afraid of facing Flora. If Pete were getting this emotional, Flora was going to cry all over him, and that would only be about his brother. He didn't know how she would react once Pete told her he'd been drafted. He didn't want his dad to hear about it like this, so he tried to put a rush on the order by filling most of it himself. But Flora wouldn't have it. You go sit down with your pops, mijo. I'll get it. Instead of mussing his hair as she always did, she grabbed Jake's face and kissed his nose. Jake turned red. He tried to be cool about it, but noticed his dad's smirk as he approached the booth. Embarrassment heated his face, making him self-conscious. As Jake watched, Flora hustled around the diner. Before long, Pete had a couple of large white paper bags sitting up on the counter. A group of 6 walked in then, and instead of having time to chat, Flora barely had time to add the condiments and fill the to-go sodas. She caught Jake's attention, not a difficult task since he'd been watching her, and indicated that the order was ready. Then she made a beeline for the new customers. Jake and his dad picked up their bags and drinks and walked back to the car. Jake was relieved. He knew he'd have to tell his parents by tomorrow, or else the army would be showing up on his doorstep to force him out at gunpoint, or so he reckoned. The drive home was quiet. With the windows rolled down, the breeze blew in, making the humidity seem not so bad. Twilight gleamed, but with the cloud cover, felt later as the darkness settled in. The scamp turned onto Cavanaugh and flew down the road. The dense trees on both sides of the road blocked out any light from the gray sky. His father turned on the headlights, and the broken, faded yellow line down the center came into view. That's when Jake saw her. It's that girl, he said, pointing ahead. What? What girl? His dad glanced to the right. The one I told you about, that I saw at Baker Farm. Mr. Williams' eyes narrowed, searching the side of the road, and then widened. Dad, pull over. We can give her a ride. It's a long walk down Cavanaugh, and it's going to rain soon. Jake cast his eyes to the sky, noting the thickening clouds and the intense humidity. His dad, however, did not slow down. We don't have time, Jake. Your mom needs us. He pressed the gas, and they sped past the girl with long blonde side-swept hair in a blue dress walking on the side of the road. She stopped and watched them as they passed. Jake stared at her, a look of apology on his face. Dad, that wasn't nice. She'll get drenched. Mr. Williams kept his eyes ahead. "She won't," was all he said. "But, Dad—" "No buts, son. Your mother needs to eat and take her sleeping pills." The tone in his father's voice said there would be no more argument. Jake couldn't believe he'd just driven by, leaving the girl walking alone after dark on a long stretch of road when they lived not far past where she was staying. They could have easily given her a ride without inconveniencing his mom for more than a few minutes. It didn't make a lick of sense, but not much had lately, and no one was acting like themselves since the news of Bobby's death. "She helped me, you know," Jake muttered as they passed the familiar oak tree. "What's that?" His dad glanced at the falling fence around the tree, then over at Jake. "Who helped you?" Jake looked at his father, disappointment in his eyes. "That girl. When I spun out in the Javelin, she was there. She must have been walking back home then because she opened the door on my side of the car and touched my face. She told me I'd be okay and that she'd get me home." His dad appeared shocked. His mouth hung open. "She spoke to you?" Jake's eyebrows rose sarcastically. "Well, yeah. She didn't mime it or anything. I've been wanting to thank her. I really should. I kind of passed out for a bit, and when I came to, she'd already gone to get help, I think. I don't know. I didn't see her after that, but offering her a ride home would have been the right thing to do after how nice she was to me." He mumbled the last words, still upset his dad had just left the girl to walk on her own. And then it hit him. He'd remembered what she told him. Funny how that works, he thought. It just came to me. His dad clammed up the rest of the way home. Almost angrily, he pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, filling the silence. They exited the car, gathering the food bags and the prescription bottle. Jake carried the drinks inside. His mother was laying on the sofa exactly where they left her earlier. It didn't look like she'd moved at all. Jake felt his heart break. Tomorrow he'd have to tell them. It would destroy his mom, but there wasn't anything he could do about it. Tonight they could eat burgers as a family one last time. Then he'd give her 2 sleeping pills, and in the morning, before he left to report in to the recruiting office in Fort Smith, he'd tell his parents. The recruiter gave Jake a week to recuperate from his injuries as per Dr. Turner's orders. In that short reprieve, Jake cared for his mother, who sank deeper into depression upon hearing her only remaining son had been drafted. He applied the hot compresses and heating pad to himself, as prescribed, and watched in confusion as his usually stoic father seemed to fall apart. Since he'd sat them down and told them the news, his dad had taken to sitting out in his old truck each night, drinking beer alone. When Jake asked him about it, his father had mumbled something about karma and consequences. It didn't make any sense at all, and with this week-long reprieve ending the next day, Jake didn't know what, if anything, he could do or say to make things better. The Army wouldn't even extend his sign-on date so he could be home for his brother's funeral. The remains of PFC Robert Williams had to be shipped from Vietnam all the way to Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was a quagmire of red tape and delays, which took nearly a month to accomplish. In that time, one person from the casualty office had contacted his mother, informed her of what the Army would cover in terms of the burial, and helped Laura Williams set a date and time for the interment at Fort Smith National Cemetery. Any other services, such as a viewing, were up to the family. And since Bobby's body suffered so much damage, it could only be a closed casket service. The doc and his wife, Ellen, stepped in to help Jake's dad with contacting the local Lutheran church to schedule the memorial. Even so, the date was 3 days past Jake's departure. He wouldn't get to say goodbye to his brother. His last day passed far too quickly, and the only thing of note was that he received his first letter from his best friend Joe. It was the only reason Jake found a smile as he looked at the familiar handwriting on the envelope. If nothing else, there was a better than average chance he'd see his friend soon. He sat down on the front porch to read it. "Hey, buddy. It's your old pal Joe. Hope this note finds you enjoying that beater you bought. Sure wish I'd had time to go running up and down Cavanaugh Road with you, fishtailing and cruising Main Street for pretty girls. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I miss Fort Smith. I know. When I left, I said I couldn't get out of there fast enough, but I had no idea. Not at all what I was heading into. Jake, whatever you do, man, don't let them draft you into this war. It's useless, man. I mean, not many of us understands what we're doing here. These people, the Vietnamese, they're so poor. They have nothing. It's way worse than you can imagine, and we're killing them. These people are civilians, and we're killing them. They never did a lick to anyone back home, and our government is just rampaging over their country. I know I'd shot a few deer and quail before, but it ain't the same as what I'm ordered to do now. I can't sleep. All I see are the faces of old men, women, kids running around inside my head. I just want to come home. This is no just war. I could probably be court-martialed just for writing this, so don't show it to anyone. But do me a favor. Just get in that piece of junk Javelin and drive up to Canada. Stay there, man. Don't come here because there ain't nothing here to fight for. It was all a lie. Just a big lie. Nixon lied to us. Anyway, I have to get up in about 2 hours to relieve the guard on duty. Maybe I'll be able to catch a few winks. Hey, tell Flora she's still the most beautiful waitress anywhere in the world, and I sure can't wait to come home and have one of Pete's burgers. Do that for me, and then get the hell out of Fort Smith. Your best friend, Joe. Jake felt defeated. He hadn't even left, and he already wanted to run away, just like Joe said he should, but it was too late. He'd already signed on the dotted line. He made the commitment, and after Bobby lost his own life, Jake felt like he owed it to his brother to finish what he started. Maybe he'd get stationed with Joe and be able to help bring his friend back from the brink. It couldn't be as bad as all that, could it? Would their government really lie to them? Why in the world would they do that? He had no answer, and the sun was beginning its descent in the western sky. He looked at his car sitting in the driveway. It was washed and waxed and would be used by his mom while he was away, but in this moment it was still his baby, and he had only one more chance to take her out for a last spin. He tucked Joe's letter into his back pocket and pulled out his keys. One last free run along Cavanaugh Road with the windows rolled down. After that, his fate was in God's and Uncle Sam's hands. You be careful, kid. Pete patted Jake on the back. Keep your head down and socks dry, and make sure you come home. The older man turned away, hiding his face as he sniffed. He picked up the knife and began chopping. Damn onions, he said. Jake felt a tug on his arm. Before he knew what was happening, Flora pulled him into a hug and began crying. Through her tears, she whispered nearly unintelligible words in between kissing his cheek. We're going to miss you, mijo. You do what Pete said. Stay safe. Don't rush off like a crazy man and do what you're told. I'll pray for you every day and light a candle until you come back to us. Jake was caught between feeling awkward and wondering if it had been a good idea to stop back into Pete's one last time, strangely enjoying having Flora fawning over him. She smelled great, and having her cry for him was oddly flattering. But he really didn't like seeing her upset, so he tried to reassure her. I promise I'll stay safe and come back. It's going to be okay, Flora. Please don't cry. He patted her back gently, not knowing what else he could do. She wouldn't let him go. Pete had to step in. Quit blubbering over the kid. He's enjoying it too much, he said with a sad chuckle. Pete pried Flora off, handing her a dish towel to dry her eyes. Jake said his goodbyes and, with a final wave, left the diner and headed back out to his car. It was time to go home. The summer heat usually cooled a bit after sundown, but the rising humidity all day decided to break just as he turned off Main Street onto Cavanaugh. Even though the rain began to fall in thick drops, Jake kept his window down, not caring at all that he was getting wet. It smelled like damp earth and felt like freedom. The breeze ruffled his brown hair, whistling softly as it flowed through the Javelin. Lightning cracked loudly overhead, illuminating the sky. In that brief moment, Jake saw her. The girl from Baker Farm was walking home in the rain. He couldn't believe she was out in this weather. Without hesitation, he pulled over just behind her. She stood with her back to him in the headlights. He leaned out. Hey there, you need a ride? He put the car in park and stepped out, getting soaked as he walked around to the passenger door. I'm Jake Williams. I live just past the baker's about a mile down. Hop in, I'll drop you off. You're going to drown out here." He pulled the door open and stood waiting. She turned around slowly, facing him. Jake gasped. She was just as pretty as he remembered from seeing her staring through the window at the diner, maybe even more so. She smiled. "Did you say Williams?" Her soft voice sounded far away and seemed to drift on the wind just beyond his hearing, but he caught her words. "Yeah, Jake Williams. I'm sort of your neighbor. Can I drive you home?" She moved gracefully toward the car. As she passed Jake, a cool wind tickled his cheek. She moved around him and slid into the passenger seat. "Don't worry about getting the seat wet or anything. It's no big deal." He closed the door and ran back around, jumping behind the wheel. He slammed the door and this time rolled the window up, but popped open the side vent. The rain would still get in, but not nearly as much. He was going to have a mess to clean up as it was, but somehow he didn't mind. He put the car in drive and got back onto the road. "So, I've been wanting to thank you." He glanced at the girl with the side-swept hair. She sat with her hands in her lap and a small smile on her soft lips. She cast her eyes his way. "Thank me?" "Yeah, for helping me last week when I spun my car out. I'm sorry if it caused you any problems, what with not being there when you came back. You said you were going to help get me home, remember?" She sat there looking at him with her big blue eyes. They had a glow about them, one that had him fully entranced. She was really pretty. He cleared his throat and continued talking. "So anyway, tomorrow I leave for basic training in San Antonio, and then after that, I'll be shipped off to Vietnam. Got my draft notice that day when I wrecked my car. It was just a really bad day." He felt a lump rise in his throat. "Found out my brother died that day, too." Tears pricked the back of his eyes. He was already over there and had been there for the past year. "There will be a funeral next week, but I won't be here." He looked away, trying to push down the rising emotions. He felt something cool on his hand and looked down. She'd placed her own small hand over his. Her comforting gesture moved him. He felt an overwhelming urge to cry, but he held it in. He didn't want to cry in front of this sweet, pretty girl. He passed the bend in the road and slowed down. The next right turn took him into the driveway of Baker Farm. It was dark at the house when he pulled in. You'd think they'd at least leave a light on for her. But then he didn't think much of the old couple since they left her to walk back and forth into town instead of driving her. He put the car in park and turned to look at her. "Well, we're here." She opened the passenger door and got out. Jake felt a warm rush of air flood the interior of the car as she left. The door closed with a soft click, and she stood in the rain beside the Javelin. "Hey, I never got your name." He leaned across the seat. "It's Ronnie Sue." Her sweet voice carried through the crack in the window. She walked toward the front porch. Jake put the car in reverse and began to back out. At the last minute, he unrolled the window and stuck his head out. "Hey, Ronnie Sue, can I write to you?" His eyes searched the porch. She was gone, already inside. Disappointed, he twisted back around and, with one last glance in the rearview mirror, drove down the gravel driveway and pulled back out onto the road. He smiled to himself. He knew the address. He'd lived here all his life, and now he knew her name. He'd write to her, and maybe, when he came back home, he'd ask her out on a date. Burgers and shakes at Pete's Diner. It wasn't much, but it was something nice to look forward to. Jake knew he wanted to get to know the shy, quiet, pretty girl who'd helped him last week, had listened to him tonight, and who never once complained about the rain. Part 5. The Long Walk Home. November 1973. The weather changed again. The cicada song had long disappeared, and the days had grown short. Hot afternoons became mild and now turned cool. The leaves were falling off the trees and piling up in the lanes. Cold rain made the decaying foliage clump together and dampened the earth. It was on such a day that I saw him. I didn't recognize him right away. His hair was shaved short, his face leaner, harder, and had lost its boyishness. He wore Army-issued camo and a faded olive green duffel bag slung over his shoulders, both of which seemed broader, stronger than before. The young man looked as if he carried the weight of the world on those shoulders. He walked slowly, head down, in no hurry. He was changed, but it was him. Jake Williams had returned. I stood in the front yard watching as he made his way down Cavanaugh Road. I waited to see if, like so many times before, he would squinch up his face and physically avoid looking in my direction. He never quite managed it. One eye would invariably open, glance over, and then he'd look into the yard before closing his eyes tight before once again looking straight ahead. This time he surprised me. He stopped. The boy would have hurried past, but the soldier standing in the road turned, facing me. He seemed to be looking right through me, but there was a hint of the young man in his tired blue eyes. I waited as he approached. He came to a standstill a mere 3 feet in front of me. "Welcome back," I said. He hesitated. "Ronnie Sue?" I felt his gaze on me like a soft touch, as if he were afraid I was not real. He looked past me over my shoulder to the old oak tree. "I used to be afraid of it, you know." "I know," I said. "And now?" "I've seen worse." He took a couple of steps toward the tree, coming closer to the now fallen wrought iron fence. "I see they finally got out." "What's got out?" I came to a stop beside him. "The ghost. My brother always told me that the fence was there to keep them in." I didn't know what to say to that. It was such a strange statement. I mean, all fences have gates, or didn't he ever notice? "You never wrote back." He stared ahead, taking in each gravestone one at a time, reading the names. I couldn't. I waited in silence, watching him lose the last remnants of fear he'd carried with him his whole life. Finally, he dropped the heavy duffel bag to the ground and walked to the edge of the fallen fence line. There, he read the last cross-shaped stone just to the side of the tree. Veronica Sue Baker. Born May 1936. Died June 1951. Our beloved Ronnie Sue. Our only daughter. Our heart. The wind whistled past, rustling the last leaves in the old oak tree. They fell, covering the sacred ground. Jake looked at me, a peculiar expression on his face. "That's you." "How can that be you?" "I think you know." I reached out, taking his hand. I could see the haunted look in his eyes. Jake had left an innocent young man and returned to Fort Smith a tortured soul. I knew he'd seen far too many ghosts over the past several years, and I hated adding to his burden. He needed to know this. It was the only way through. "I wrote you so many letters." I don't understand." He shook his head. My thumb caressed his knuckles. "I know. I saw them." I'd watched my mother open each one, reading the words, confused. They'd made her cry, and it broke my heart. "Dear Ronnie Sue, this place is so different. Not what I expected at all. Gunfire and bombs are so loud, I feel like I'm losing my mind. But sometimes it's so quiet, I'm terrified. It feels like I'm being watched. And if I turn around, I might find a monster at my back. I can't sleep, and it's wearing me down. I miss home, and I sure can't wait to come back and take you out on our date. Oh, I forgot to ask you on that last night. Will you go out with me? I know it will be a while, but maybe, just maybe, you might wait for me? Missing your sweet smile, Jake Williams." "But you never once wrote back." He waited, watching my face, then looked back over his shoulder at the stone cross. Something shifted in his eyes. You couldn't. I could see him thinking, but then, how can I? Come with me. I tugged his hand, pulling him along as I walked toward Cavanaugh Road. My bag, he stumbled after me. Leave it here, it'll keep. He followed me, still holding my hand. We walked down past the bend in the road and then another mile, arriving at the Williams house. His Javelin was parked out front, a for sale sign in the window. Now, why would Mom go and do that? She hadn't mentioned anything about selling my car in her letters. Some of the pain left his eyes as he looked at his home. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, and he walked to the front porch. Wait! I called after him, but he ignored me. I stood patiently waiting as he reached out to grab the doorknob. Nothing happened. He tried again, and still the door did not move. Ronnie Sue, something's wrong. He made several swipes at the door, failing each time to get a grip on the handle. Jake. I called his name softly, sadness in my voice. The sound of an engine behind us caught both our attention. A black and brown scamp pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel. The car pulled next to the Javelin and stopped. Jake ran to the vehicle, calling out, Dad! Dad, I'm home! Mr. Williams got out, then closed the door before making his way to the front door. He stopped, looking around. Dad! It's me, Jake! Where Jake moved quickly at first, he now moved with caution, afraid yet not sure why. Mr. Williams looked at the Javelin, pain radiating from his soul. He sniffed and raised his hand to wipe his eye before heading into the house. Dad! Dad! Jake called after his father over and over again. I watched him pass by me, only inches between us. Joshua, I whispered, my own voice barely audible. When the door closed, Jake ran to me, yelling, What the hell was that, Ronnie Sue? What's going on? I promised you, Jake. Promise me what? What are you talking about? He was distraught, and I knew it wasn't yet over. I promised you I'd help, that I'd get you home. I held out my hand. He stood staring at it like it was a snake about to bite him, but finally he took it, twining his fingers in my own. Where are we going, Ronnie Sue? He fell in step beside me, occasionally glancing back at the house where he grew up. Fort Smith National Cemetery, I said. Confusion filled him, then horror. I waited patiently as understanding dawned. Don't be afraid. I'm here with you, every step of the way, now and always. We left the Williams house behind. Jake gripped my hand so tight, as if afraid to let go, but with each step, I felt him begin to accept his new reality. There would be no more fear of ghosts, for we only fear that which we don't understand, that which is other. We do not fear who and what we are. For Jake, there were no more scary wrought iron fences, no need to turn his eyes away. He was the one who got out, and he was not alone. Together, we made our way down Cavanaugh Road, past the bend in the road and the old oak tree. And when he smiled at me, I knew it was time to make the final, long walk home. This has been Cavanaugh Road by best-selling author Michelle E. Gwynn, narrated by Michelle E. Gwynn.